All right, so here we go. So my name is Ido Aharoni. I'm very, very happy to have been asked by the wonderful team at Leumi to chat with you today a little bit about the American system, trying to understand better what's going on in the American system. It's very different than the Israeli system. It's something that we will be discussing. Let me just say before I begin, those of you who would like to ask me questions, I'm hoping to speak for about 30, 35 minutes and then answer your questions. There's a Q&A function right at the bottom of the screen. Just ask a question through that function and I will do my best to answer your question. A few words about myself. I'm a former Israeli diplomat. I've been working in private consultancy for the last 4 years. I've been working with Bank Leumi during that time. Very happy with the bank, very happy with their vision, with their creativity, and more importantly, with the high quality of their human resources from the top, from Avner all the way down. Incredible team, incredible institution, and I'm very happy to share my thoughts with you. I prepared a few slides for you that will allow me to touch upon the issues that I would like to cover. So I was asked to speak about understanding the American system in light of COVID-19, the riots, and beyond, which I will gladly do. And in many ways, COVID-19 is the perfect storm. In what sense? First of all, it exposed globally the leadership crisis. We see leaders that are obsessed with themselves, interested with themselves, not to say narcissistic. It exposed the underperformance of the healthcare system almost worldwide, the underpreparedness of that health system. In many places, governmental ineptitude, like what you're seeing in the United States. What happens when you have to make decisions in a situation of uncertainty? COVID-19, there is much to be learned about this virus. And of course, what happens when we are bombarded with too much information and irrelevant information. It brings up the level of anxiety. We call this information overload, and it's a real problem. In fact, some people are talking about the need not only to maintain social distancing, but also informational distancing, which is a very, very important term that we will hear more about in the future. So what are the things that we do know about the future? Not much, but that much we do know. We know that in the future, life expectancy will go up. So if in the early 20th century, life expectancy for men in the United States was around 65, then by the end of the 21st century, it's going to be 95. We do know that the vast majority of people are going to move in cities, right? World population that is now at 7.5 billion is going to be close to 10 billion by the year 2050, and 75% of them will live in major urban centers. Even today in the United States, almost 80% of Americans live in cities, which are communities with at least 100,000 people and more. And then the third thing that we know is that many of the jobs that we're familiar with are going to be replaced by very precise algorithms, if not robotics and automated machines, through artificial intelligence and other forms of automation and software. Those three elements are basically turning the classic social contract that was devised and designed and crafted in the early 20th century with the rise of industrialization and with the rise of the working class. There was a need to safeguard the rights of the workers. And so a social contract was designed. That social contract said the following: you, the citizen, your job is to be productive, to pay taxes, and to abide by the law. We, the state or the government, our job is to provide you with basic health, basic education, and basic security. And that system was supposed to maintain an equilibrium because the system was designed according to the information that was relevant at the time, meaning people were not supposed to live much beyond 65. Well, now look at what's happening in Israel, for example, when life expectancy is 81. We're paying 2.5 pensions for every IDF officer position. Not we're paying the position for the current officer and then 1.5 retired officers on the same position, meaning governments did not plan for the extra 35 years, and therefore the equilibrium was distorted. The system is actually unsustainable, and COVID-19 exposed that, that fact. Now, there is, in my view, there is going to be an inevitable clash between two approaches post-COVID-19. The first approach is the approach that says, wait a second, COVID-19 was a way for the universe to tell us something. We need to take a stop. We need to consume responsibly. We need to pay attention to the climate change crisis. We need to engage in more collaborative international relations. Businesses have to have a purpose. If you're a bank, if you're a credit card company, it's not just enough to look at the profit line. You have to have a purpose. And engaging in smart communities and smart businesses and smart applications is not enough. What people will look for is something called livable life. It's not important. It's not just important to live in a smart city. I want to live in a livable city. That's going to be one approach that will be undoubtedly, it's already happening. You're seeing it in the streets of the United States with the other approach that says, wait a second, let's look at what happened before COVID-19. The world was experiencing an unprecedented level of prosperity. It was a win-win situation. The agent of the pandemic was global travel. Let's limit globalization. Let's limit global travel. Let's deal with our own issues first, right? America comes first. Israel comes first. So these are very isolationist sentiments that are going to be boosted. And this approach, I would say you could describe it as the approach that says, let's quickly resume the old order. And there is an inevitable clash with the other approach that says, let's prepare for the new normal or the new abnormal. Life will never be the same. These are two approaches that are already clashing, and you see it every day in the United States. Possible scenarios. One scenario is that the United States will have the strength and the power to introduce a New Deal. The New Deal was enacted under President Roosevelt, and basically was a massive investment in infrastructure. Everything that you see today in the United States, from the massive bridges and the tunnels and the highways and the railroads was before that, but the major real estate projects like Levittown on the East Coast and Lakewood City on the West Coast, those are all part and elements of that New Deal. The other thing that we'll probably see is a quicker shift to what we call flex economy. Flex economy is an economy that is based on freelancers, an economy that is not necessarily rooting you to a place. You can work from everywhere. If you're familiar with the Israeli platform Fiverr, that's probably the future of employment. In your world, the financial world will probably see a faster move to cashless world, contactless cards, blockchain-based technologies. Competition will resume, but competition will resume together with collaboration. Very much like what happened in the world after the end of World War II. The world created in 1945 in San Francisco, the United Nations. United Nations was created in San Francisco because of the understanding, as a response to the trauma of World War II, we need to have collaborative diplomacy. We need to have collaborative international relations. I cannot even begin to describe how globally important the upcoming November 2020 elections are going to be, not just for the United States, way beyond the United States, because in many ways it will signal the direction in that clash that I was describing between the new order people versus the old order people. And obviously Trump represents the old order clearly. Now, I'm going to touch upon 5 verticals very briefly. Understanding the American system, the economy, understanding the entire philosophy behind the American credit system. I'm not talking about credit card system. I'm talking about the whole idea that debt is actually a good thing for the economy. The defense approach, the American system when it comes to the defense doctrine, dramatically different than the Israeli security doctrine. The legal system, the political system, and obviously the society. The United States is undergoing for many years, way before the riots started, undergoing a deep social change. Here you can see the ID card of the United States. We're looking at over 330 million people. So this is the growth in the last decade alone from 308 to 330. GDP per capita actually went up significantly in the last decade. 63,000 used to be 55. Density per square mile, 93 people per square mile. It used to be 4 people when the United States was founded. The median age is today 38. It used to be 29 in 1960, which means that the American population is getting older. Life expectancy, it's a very alarming piece of information, is actually going down. It used to be 81, it went down to 78. Level of urbanization is 82%. Again, the definition of an urban center in the United States is at least 100,000 people. In Israel, it's at least 20,000 people. And 74% of the Americans describe themselves as Christian. America is still very religious. On a scale of religiosity, the United States is far more religious than the state of Israel, and I'll be more than happy to answer questions about that. So the undercurrents that are taking place in the United States for quite some time, it's not something new. America is becoming more and more urban. America is becoming more and more secular, meaning less and less Americans are reporting that they're religious. It's becoming more and more ethnic, and it's polarized politically, unlike Israel, where the political system gravitates towards the center. In the United States, the gravitation actually is towards the extremes. America is experiencing the repercussions of the information revolution more than other nations because of the level of connectivity in the United States, which is much higher than, let's say, a country like India. Israel is no example because in Israel, the level of connectivity is even higher than in the United States. And lastly, the United States, and this is perhaps the main reason why you're seeing what you're seeing today in the United States, there's a deepening systemic inequality. Make no mistake, the riots that you see in the United States are not necessarily about the individual named George Floyd. It's about what it represented, what the way he died represented, the inequality. No one, and no one should die in police custody. No one should be mistreated by the police. That's the issue. And when you're looking at the coalition of minorities that is going to shape America's future, this is what you're looking at. You're looking at 55 million Latinos plus 15 million, an estimate of another 15 million Latinos who are undocumented, meaning they're not legally in the United States, although they're physically there. You're looking at 40 million African Americans. You're looking about 16 million Asians. I include in that group also people of Indian background, people from Indonesia, from Malaysia, Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Filipinos, and so on. There are 6 million people who describe themselves as gays. They're part of that coalition. And 7 million Jews, more or less. And it's very important to indicate that the gay community, obviously, there's an overlap because you can be Asian and gay and Jewish and gay and so on and so forth. But this is really the coalition of minorities. When you're looking at the people rebelling against the old order, these are the people. Now, you may ask why the Jews are in that group, because in their eyes, they're still a minority, although their integration into the general society has been one of the most amazing success stories. A little bit about politics, so that to break the the perception. It's very important to understand how, if America is largely urban, then what's the story when it comes to the national elections? Now, this you have to understand. Americans do not vote for presidential national elections the way they vote for state level elections or municipal elections. Here's an example looking at the top 50 cities in the United States. 35 of the mayors are Democrats, only 13 are Republicans. You can see here the major cities in the United States. This is the list of the top 13 or 14 cities: New York, LA, Chicago, Houston, Phoenix. These are all Democratic mayor. Philadelphia. Even the mayors, like in Texas, the elections for mayor in Texas are by definition nonpartisan, although the candidates can be representatives of political parties. Even in Texas, most of the mayors of the major cities are Democrats or independents with a Democratic position, just like Michael Bloomberg was in New York. And make no mistake, Texas is a red state in national presidential election and has been a red state for several decades now. Now, what does it mean? It means that when people congregate, the cities tend to attract people who are more liberal than conservative. Hillary Clinton, for example, won out of the 100 top urban centers in the United States. I think she won in 85 of them. Yet she lost the elections, and I'll be more than happy to speak about how that happened. The main principle of the American system is called federalism. It's a combination of a centralized system, which means that the federal government has the authority to print money, which is their biggest clout, their biggest source of leverage. And obviously they collect taxes. But there's also forces that, that push for decentralization, which means giving more power to state level. For example, the voting regulations, the electoral college is very much in the hands of the state legislators in each and every state of the 50 states. And then, of course, the state and the city are allowed to collect taxes themselves. The design of the federalist system is highly complex, and it's been around more or less in this shape since the 1700s. There's a very complex division of powers, but the idea is to maintain central government while safeguarding the rights of the states and the central government. The Americans are largely divided. The reason why they have such a long-standing tradition of a two-party political system, unlike, let's say, the Israeli or the European tradition, is because those parties stand for very, very clear worldviews. You can say that the Republicans are more identified with conservatism. This is not to say there are no Democrats who are conservatives, and the liberals are more aligned with the Democratic Party. Again, this is not to say that there are no conservative people voting Democrat and vice versa. It's very, very important to understand. This is a very long list of the values that each camp stand for, but no less importantly is what they have in common. And what they have in common is the belief in the centrality of the Constitution, the belief in free market, basic rights. And here you can see a very long list of things that make America unique, like entrepreneurship. In the United States alone, there are 5,500 universities. There are 11 million research students. And if you look at the total number of students, including adult education and community colleges, you're looking at 23 million students in the United States alone. It's the #1 hub of creativity in the world. It's the #1 producer of popular culture in the world. And there's a concept in diplomacy called soft power, which means the things that you do in order to convince others to believe in what you represent without using military force or without using economic sanctions. The United States is by far the world leader in what we call the ability to produce soft power. And these are the values that both camps share in common. The Americans have a very interesting national ethos. You cannot understand the United States without understanding their national ethos. What is the national ethos? Is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. The national ethos of the Americans is called the American Dream. The American Dream is very simple. It says the following: if you're willing to work hard, if you're willing to abide by the law, if you are a decent human being, the sky is the limit. This is where the phrase, the land of opportunity, came from. The belief, the firm belief, that if you are willing to work hard, if you're willing to abide by the law, and if you are a decent human being that believes in compromise, that believes in doing the right thing, then the sky's the limit. Then there is no limit to what you can achieve. And that is a very powerful narrative because it fuels the economy, because it fuels people's motivation. People believe that they can, and they reach to the stars, right? For comparison, this is the national ethos of Israel. The story that we tell ourselves about ourselves is that we are here to prevent a second Auschwitz. Never again is the national ethos of the State of Israel. Now, what happens when the national ethos of a nation becomes a work plan? A very difficult thing happens. It means that there is no limit to what you're willing to invest in preventing a second Auschwitz. We'll talk about that in a second. There are fundamental differences between Israel and the United States. In Israel, we don't have constitution. We do have the Declaration of Independence, or more accurately, the Proclamation of Independence, which serves as a loose legal basis for a series of basic laws that were enacted since the 1960s until today. Unlike in the United States, we don't have a separation between religion and state. The prime minister in Israel is first among equals. There are no presidential powers. That's one of the reasons why Israeli prime ministers and Israeli ministers find themselves in jail. There is a very tightly regulated business environment in Israel. In the United States, the things that are allowed by the American law in terms of the interface between politics and business are considered illegal in Israel. Israel is far more secular than the United States on a scale of religiosity. For example, in Israel, I don't see a bill that says, "In God we trust." In Israel, as I said before, unlike the United States, we have a viable political center that produces the most important and the most influential policies. And lastly, unlike the American society, Israeli society is very, very informal. Let me give you a couple of examples from your world about how different the American system is from the Israeli system, or for that matter, from many other systems in the world. We're all familiar with the cultural and the economic attitude to the concept of debt. In every culture almost, debt is not a good thing. In Israel, for example, look at how the government is very reluctant to pour money into the economy because they don't want to increase the external debt of the State of Israel. Well, in America, and that was the whole idea behind the New Deal, in the United States, actually debt is viewed as a positive economic force. Why? Because for one, it enhances social stability. The more money you owe, the more pressure there is on you as an individual to abide by the law, to work hard, pay your taxes, and pay your bills. Cash flow is king in that type of world. So the more debt you accrue, the more credit you get. That's the whole logic of the American credit philosophy. It's very different than the Israeli system that doesn't like to encourage people to assume debt. Another example, American individualism. When we looked at the differences between conservatives and liberals, one thing they had in common, and that is the national ethos of individualism. Unlike Israel, that was built upon a collective foundation, and where you were judged by your contribution to the collective. In America, you're being judged by your own individual achievements. The best example of American individualism is the political struggle, the political battle around the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment, known as the right to bear arms, is one of the 10 amendments that form the Bill of Rights, and it says the following: a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, it's hard for us to understand. If you live in New York or if you live in Chicago, it's hard for you to understand where it comes from. But if you live in a remote ranch in the middle of Texas, or if you live in a farm in Montana, this is very, very meaningful. When we talk about the way the West, the American West, was habitated, the way it was settled, the process, it really required a great deal of courage on the part of the individual. And the Second Amendment was there to protect them, to allow them to protect themselves and their families. And so in many ways, the political struggle over the Second Amendment is the political struggle between urban America and the heartland. And again, I'll be more than happy to talk about that later during the Q&A session. The American security doctrine stands on four legs: the need to protect the homeland, the need to promote American prosperity, the need to preserve peace through strength, and the need to advance American influence all over the world. That has been the American security doctrine for many, many years. Just for comparison, the Israeli security doctrine is very different. It stands on three legs. One says the need to defend our people by building a strong military. Our military, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, is considered to be a large military in absolute numbers as well, not just in comparison to the size of our nation. The second leg is the need to prevent and preempt the enemy attacking, and we've seen it historically when Israel destroyed the Iraqi nuclear reactor, when Israel destroyed the nuclear reactor in Syria in 2006, when Israel is attacking Iranian targets in Syria. This is all part of that second leg that says our job is to prevent the calamity, to prevent the threat. And then the third leg, the most important leg, is the deterrent. The presence of a highly advanced weapon system that would deter the enemy. This idea of the ultimate deterrent came to Ben Gurion when he looked at the way World War II ended, with 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. This is a picture from 1961 in New York, very famous meeting between JFK and David Ben Gurion, where JFK was asking Ben Gurion, tell me the truth, what are you guys doing down there in Dimona? And don't give me this baloney that you're manufacturing textile. And Ben Gurion, off the cuff, his answer became Israel's official policy on this issue. He said, Mr. President, rest assured, Israel will not be the first country to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East. In other words, he did not deny, but he also did not confirm. And from that day on, since 1961 until today, when you ask an Israeli official about whether Israel has nuclear military capabilities, the answer is going to be this, what Ben Gurion told JFK in 1961. And that's what happens when your operational, when your national ethos becomes into your operational plan. When never again becomes an operational plan, then a country that had no money, that had no natural resources, that had no support of the major powers of the time. Israel did not have the support of the Soviet Union. Israel did not have the support of the United States. That's what happens when a country that has nothing but is determined to turn never again into an operational working plan. That's what happens. That kind of deterrent is being introduced. When it comes to the defense philosophies, I have to take a time out and speak about how cultures differ and nations differ with their defense philosophies. We all know that in order for your enemy to succeed, 3 things have to happen. 3 preconditions have to exist. First of all, your enemy has to be motivated to attack you. Your enemy has to have the weapons to attack you, the capabilities. And lastly, your enemy has to have the opportunity to attack you. When you look at the an attack like 9/11, all three elements were there. You had a group of highly motivated people to inflict harm on the American people. They had the weapons. In their case, they had the airplanes and two weapons. And then they had the opportunity, the unsecured or not sufficiently secured airports. Now, when you look at how cultures and systems and governments differ, it's very, very interesting. Some countries say, our job, we understand there are people out there with high motivation to attack us. They may even have the most advanced weapons to attack us. But our job is to emphasize the need to deprive them of the opportunity to attack, right? We call them police states. These are the countries that send scores of secret agents to the street to deprive the enemy of the opportunity to attack. Most countries, including the United States, are focusing their efforts for a variety of reasons. In the case of the United States, is a legal reason because of the Constitution, on the need to deprive the enemy of the weapon. The capabilities are the most important thing. We call it the smoking gun approach, right? It's a legal term known in the United States. When you arrive at an American airport, or at least when you arrived before COVID-19, they were going through your bag looking for what? For an object. Israel is unique in the sense that Israel actually is more interested in the motivation of the enemy than anything else. We are, of course, interested in depriving them of the weapons and depriving them of the opportunities. But the most important thing that the Israeli system is doing, relying on a very sophisticated intelligence platform, is identify the motivation. And if you may, this is also the explanation to the very big debate between the Israeli government and the US administration over the Iranian nuclear deal. Why the United States was satisfied with preventing the Iranians from producing a bomb, the Israelis were very frustrated that the agreement did not address the issue which in the eyes of the Israelis is the most important issue, the motivation that the regime stands for. The Israelis were frustrated because they say, wait a second, what about what the Iranians are doing with conventional weapons? Look at what they're doing, how they're destabilizing nations around us. What are they going to do when they have a nuclear weapon? It's not a good idea to let them have it. And the Americans were happy by saying, well, we are going to prevent them from producing the bomb. Israel said, well, it's not enough. We need to address what they stand for, their motivation. Systemic characteristics, as I said before, the United States is based on individualism, long-term planning, a strict compliance, and it's a merciless society in many, many ways. And this is why one of the reasons people are marching, because they feel that there is no solidarity, right? Israel was at the same time was built on collectivism, while the Americans are very big on long-term planning. The Israelis are very big on improvisation. Israelis are less formal, so for them compliance is more like a recommendation, and the society enjoys a much greater degree of solidarity. Here's one example. 1 of every 5 prisoners in the world is incarcerated in the United States. I'll say more than that. The United States, the number of prisoners in the United States is close to over 3 million, which means 1% of the American population is in jail. You can see here the comparison, almost 700 Americans for every 100,000 people are incarcerated in the United States. In Israel, it's less than a third of that. Peter Drucker, the big guru of management, said, culture will eat strategy for breakfast. What he meant by that is that you can think about strategic solutions and you can present plans as long as you wish. At the end of the day, it's really the culture that would determine, that would determine the performance of the place. So I just chose to show you one tiny example. If you want to understand the American system, when I came to Los Angeles in 1994 as a diplomat, I was in Los Angeles before that, But when I came to Los Angeles in 1994 as a diplomat, our office was on this boulevard. It's called Wilshire Boulevard. And I was amazed how wide this boulevard was. And it's an inner city route. It's albeit a major route, but still it's not a highway. It's a Wilshire Boulevard is just a street in Los Angeles. There are many streets like that. And look at the size of it. And I was wondering, when was it planned? And the answer was 1933. And then, you know, I came to visit Israel and I took a ride on the famous Route 6, which was an Israeli major undertaking. And you can see here, the year 2020, Israel's major transportation route has only 2 lanes in each direction. That's the whole story right there. That's the whole story. That's strategy will be eaten by culture for breakfast every day. If you may, it's like the distinction between an aircraft carrier and a small paddleboard, which can be easily maneuvered. When you look at the American system, and I know that many of you who deal with Americans are frustrated how rigid they are. Why can't they be flexible? Why can't they do me a favor? Why can't they do this or that? And the reason is because they don't have the luxury of doing that. When you run such a huge system with 330 million people, with so many institutions, you just can't have people improvise like you can in Israel, which is a nation of 9 million people. A few words about the American system. You're all familiar with the 3 branches of the US government. There's an open debate of whether the president is indeed so powerful or powerless. The Constitution says the president is not only the head of state and the chief diplomat and the chief legislator, he's also the commander-in-chief and he's the chief executive of the nation. But at the same time, the president is severely restricted by Congress and Senate. The Congress is divided into the upper house, 100 members, 2 from each state, and the lower house with 435 representatives elected by the population, divided into districts. Each state has a different size congressional delegation to the Congress, and you can see how the Congress can actually limit the powers of the president. Presidents that do not have the political skill to work alongside Congress cannot achieve much. And I will let you figure it out yourselves. Who are those presidents I'm referring to? The Congress can make laws, obviously can recommend the impeachment. The Senate has to approve the impeachment of the president, but also can override presidential veto, which is something most people don't know. The Congress can declare war. The Congress has the power of the purse, meaning has the power to spend dollars. The Senate approves all the appointments, approves all the international treaties, approves all the ambassadors, and the president must present once a year the State of the Union address in front of the Senate, which is like a report and a report card to the system. This is the complexity of the American system. Again, very different than the Israeli system. Congress has the power to veto legislation and so on and so forth. Most important thing, before I jump into the Jewish community and the Israelis that live in America, in the United States, the electoral system is not based like here, one person, one vote. In fact, you're voting for what we call the Electoral College. Each state's legislator is deciding how their own electors are chosen. There are a total number of 538 electors in total. You can see proportionately divided between states. And you need, as a candidate, at least 270 votes in order to win a majority, right? So you're not voting for a president, you're voting for a mediator. So there's a mediating element in between called the Electoral College. And the Electoral College, actually, if you win 270 electors, you decide the fate of the elections. One very, very important distinction, again, something the Israelis find it very difficult to understand, the power of the governors. The 10th Amendment, which is the final amendment of the original Bill of Rights, was added in order to assure delegates from the various states that the federal government would not step outside the boundaries established in the Constitution. It reads, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." Meaning, at the end of the day, the governors have the authority to manage a crisis like COVID-19 or manage a crisis like the riots. When you see who are the people that are actually managing the crisis on a daily basis, these are the governors and the mayors. Now, America, as I said before, is highly complex and cities are different. For example, in the greater New York area, New York has 5 boroughs, right? Manhattan, Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island. Each borough, by the way, has its own elected president, but they are not influential. The mayor is in charge of all 5 boroughs. In Los Angeles, for example, the mayor of Los Angeles is in charge only of the city of Los Angeles, and the city of Los Angeles is part of LA County. LA County is managed by 5 commissioners elected directly by the public. Those county supervisors are in charge of the county. The city is only one element in the county. And the person in charge of safety and security for the entire Los Angeles County is actually the sheriff of LA County and not the commander of LAPD. The sheriff is elected by the entire population of the county, whereas the mayor is elected by 1/3 of the number, because in LA you have about 4 million people, LA County about 11 million people. So the sheriff is actually has the largest voters base, much bigger than the mayor of LA. And again, the same structure appears in other places. For example, the city of Atlanta, which is only 500,000 people, but actually serves 2 different counties. It's part of Fulton County, but also part of DeKalb County. It represents, their city council represents the 12 different districts, plus 3 other general representatives. And interesting, since 1973, and again, Georgia is a red state, meaning voting Republican, traditionally, at least for the last several decades. But since 1973, all the mayors of Atlanta have been members of the African American community. A big question about the Jewish community, and we in Israel talk a lot about assimilation, which I think is an inappropriate term to describe Jewish life in the United States, because it assumes that the very fact of a Jew marrying outside of his or her faith is not a bad thing, is a different negative connotation to it. Well, in the United States, there are 330 million people. 180 million of them identify as liberals. It's important when I say liberals, I'm not necessarily referring to progressives or people that vote for the Democratic Party. Many conservatives view themselves as liberals. The United States is a liberal system. There's a huge difference between being a liberal and being a social liberal in the United States. There are about 7 million Jews, but what most Israelis are unaware of is that those 7 million Jews, like my wife, for example, are connected through marriage to between 30 to 40 million people who are not Jews by the Jewish religious law. Very, very important distinction. And they have, by definition, a positive predisposition when it comes to Israel and when it comes to Jewish life. Because at the end of the day, the number of Jews that are actually involved in organized Jewish life is very, very small, and I estimate them as less than 500,000. These are the main hubs where you can find Jewish life in North America. I also included Toronto here because although Toronto is not part of the United States, it's one of the most important Jewish communities in the world. In the United States, we have 3,500 congregations, nearly 3 million people that visit them at least once a year, and they are representing 584 counties. When it comes to organized Jewish life, those 500,000 Jews that I mentioned before, they're divided into 2 types of organizations. Organizations that are meant to defend the interest of the Jewish people, like the Anti-Defamation League, Wiesenthal, the Jewish Community Relations Community. You have organizations that their job is to lobby on behalf of the interests of the State of Israel, like AIPAC. AIPAC has one job, and that is to secure the foreign aid bill every year. Then you have the welfare organizations like the federations, the JCCs. What they do, they raise money for the well-being of the entire community, and some portion of that money actually ends up with the Jewish Agency, about 17%. And then recently, in recent years, there's a fourth type of organizations that I call them broadening the conversation organizations that are engaged in a different conversation about Israel, not your typical geopolitical analysis of the conflict, but actually conversation about Israel in the context of the environment, like the Jewish National Fund is doing, conversation about Israel in the context of education, like the America-Israel Friendship League is doing, or Birthright, which is the best example of the BTC type of organizations. When you look at the Jewish community's Israel agenda, it's very different than the real world. The American Jews are primarily concerned with BDS. Just in parenthesis, I want you to know Israel is not boycotted. In fact, the opposite is happening. Israel has never been more accepted all over the world, including in the Arab world. They're dealing with the Iranian deal. They're dealing with the issue of terrorism. Holocaust denial is a big issue for them, although you couldn't say, although there are Holocaust deniers here and there, Holocaust denial is not an all-encompassing social or academic phenomenon. They're concerned with the issue of assimilation, again, failing to see the opportunity that comes with it. And obviously, they're preoccupied with the issue of anti-Semitism. And again, I think that anti-Semitism in the United States today is much larger. It's part of a much bigger wave of hatred and hate crimes towards the other. The other can be gay, can be black, can be Jewish, can be Latino, and so on and so forth. If you watch the show, Who is America? Sacha Baron Cohen defines Israeli DNA. He's linking Israel clearly to the conservative base of America. And again, if you haven't seen it, I urge you to watch it, especially the character Ran Murad, the security expert from Israel. American Jews, the largest religious movement among them is the Reform movement. The second largest is conservative. About 8% of them are Orthodox, but the vast majority of them are unaffiliated. And I would say only 15% of them are engaged. I will end with a word about Israelis in America, and then we'll open the floor to handle some of your questions. I've heard numbers that in Israel, there are millions of Israelis that live in America. Sometime even they use the number 1.5 million. It's very difficult to know. In fact, nobody knows how many Israelis live in America. And the reason is because of the citizenship law. The citizenship law says that if you were born to an Israeli, or if you were a grandchild of an Israeli, then you are an Israeli by law, you are Israeli by birth, and you have to settle your status vis-a-vis the Israeli government and the Israeli army. If you go by the citizenship law itself, you can reach very, very large numbers. But the real definition is how many people that are Israelis, ex-Israelis, or children or grandchildren of Israelis that feel a personal connection to Israel, that Israel is part of their personality, that speak the language, that live and breathe Israel. That's the criteria. And I believe that that number is much smaller. And I will be surprised if it's more than 2K, 200,000. I'll be very surprised, and I can tell you more about that during the Q&A sessions. My friends, this is my, my quick and brief overview. And at this point, I'd like to open the floor for your questions, please. So Tzvia is asking, would love to hear more about the future of U.S.-Israel relations. It's an excellent question. Israel is um, is experiencing a very dangerous situation. I call it ethnocentrism. What is ethnocentrism? When a country and a society and a culture is unable to view the world through any other prism but its own. In our case, the question is, what's good for the Israelis, right? When that's your approach, it's a very dangerous place to be in, because that coalition of minorities that I showed you at the very beginning, that's the coalition that is going to determine the fate of the United States. And Israel has done very little to build bridges with this coalition, unfortunately. Not only that, we neglected the need to cultivate ties with our Jewish brothers and sisters. Israeli governments of late have done anything within their power to disengage them from the failure of the Western Wall compromise, all the way to the fact that the more progressive streams of Judaism have really no access to the Israeli government. And I think we're going to pay dearly, all of us. Our children are going to pay. And I'm afraid that even our grandchildren are going to pay for the mistakes that we made. Who do you think will win the upcoming elections in the United States? Do current events help more to a certain candidate? Well, depends. Obviously, I don't know who's going to win. I can tell you that I did not predict the victory of Donald Trump in 2016. I was surprised that he won, but after I studied it, I became surprised how come I didn't see it, that he was a much stronger brand than Hillary. So the brand is still strong. What attracts people to Trump is the fact that he is authentic, or at least is being perceived as authentic, as livable, as impulsive, as reflexive. He's being himself. And he is the counter reaction to the culture of political correctness. I just read the other day that the editor of the op-ed section in the New York Times, James Bennett, resigned because he published an article by someone who offended some of the readers. He had to resign, which is an incredibly stupid move. Why would you have him resign? So what? So someone read an article they didn't like? What's the big deal? Why do you have to resign? That's the PC. The Trump represents the opposition to that PC. It's a very powerful position to be in. And so, despite the fact that I read today that his disapproval rating is at all-time high, 58% of the American people disapprove of his performance, I still think that Trump is a very powerful brand. And what he is selling the American people is authenticity, reflexivity, and impulsive nature, which is what they wanted after many, many years of, I call it PC tyranny, the tyranny of political correctness. And people are fed up with it. Another thing about the riots, there's a huge difference between glorifying George Floyd. Those who are doing it are actually doing a disservice to Joe Biden, and protesting the principle, which is nobody should die in police custody. There's a huge difference between talking about the principle, about the universal values that were violated, as opposed to glorifying George Floyd, the individual. If you read about him, you'll know why I don't think it's a great idea for the people that speak on behalf of tolerance and progress to glorify someone like him. Nobody should die in police custody. And George Floyd is no exclusion, of course. Rodney King, same thing. There's a huge difference. There's a fine line. And so the riots could help Biden, but could also damage Biden. There's a very, very fine line right there. All right, another question. What's the major reason for decreasing religion? Oh, okay, so the main reason why the United States is becoming more secular is the same reason why Israel is becoming more secular, and it's those devices. Those devices changed the world. 2007 will be remembered in history as the year that changed the world. Why? Because it gave us the opportunity to self-design our own informational feed. When that moment happened, the world has changed. Because if it's not in your feed, it doesn't exist. And my feed is different than your feed. There are no two feeds that are identical. We are now in a position where companies can collect up to 15,000 data points on each user. Now, when you are exposed to this abundance of information, some of it relevant, some of it irrelevant, then it really changes the way you see things. And so it's not that people are less, firm in their faith or not. It's the description, how they describe themselves is changing. The story they tell themselves about themselves is changing. We know it when we look at the younger generation of the evangelical community, when their parents and their grandparents were connected to Israel on a theological level, their children are looking for a different kind of connection. They are not automatically connecting with Israel like their parents and their grandparents, although they come from the same religious background. It's a very, by the way, in Israel, the same thing is happening. The religious people feel the onslaught. They feel they're under attack by the information revolution, and therefore they are externalizing their religious symbols. So all of a sudden the yarmulkes are becoming bigger. The tzitziot are becoming longer. The bumper stickers on the cars are becoming bigger and bigger. And the reason is, and the word that they use is litchazek, to be stronger. Why do you have to be stronger? Because they feel they're under attack. And who's attacking them? Technology. And so that's happening all over the world. Religious people, people of faith, they feel that they're being bombarded by information, by new sources, by new ideas, by new images, by new concepts, and many of them open up, and many of them decide to, to close down. It's a very interesting thing. We'll see more questions. Is Biden? If Biden is going to be elected, how do you see it affecting Israel? I think Joe Biden's record on Israel is impeccable. I don't see any problem whatsoever with Biden. I think that Biden already committed to select a running mate that is going to be a female. So probably he will select an African-American female. In light of what's happening now, Kamala Harris comes to mind, the senator from California. I don't know if she will be as comfortable as he is with Israel, but I don't see any problem with that. I don't see any problem with that. All right, dear folks, we're exactly at 8 p.m. Israel time, which is 1 p.m. your time. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much. Noah has my email if you would like to continue this conversation with me. I'll be more than happy to. God bless you. Greetings from Jerusalem. Bye-bye.